Hughes.
Thank you, Acting Deputy President. Well, I also rise today to stand in solidarity with the people of Israel in commemoration of one of the worst pogroms that has been perpetuated against innocent civilians in a single day since the Holocaust. I honour the innocent civilians in Israel who daily live in fear, in a hostile region full of hate-filled people who want to see them eradicated in their entirety. I weep for the hostages who were taken, beaten, tortured, raped and brutally murdered, never to see families again, simply because they were Jewish. I celebrate those who were liberated and released, and we will keep in our prayers the hostages who are yet to be released. My heart breaks for the great loss of life that war and conflict bring. Explosives don't discriminate between civilians and militants. That's the cost of war. But Hamas does discriminate. Hezbollah does discriminate. So let's not forget what led us here. And for all those who show bitter concern for the innocents caught up in the conflict, I can hear their deafening silence in the face of these barbaric acts committed on Israeli soil. The hypocrisy from those in this country who dare to upset our civil system of tolerance and respect, to bring hatred across the sea to our diverse landscape, and in doing so threaten to upend our peace and security in the process. These are the people who protest so-called genocide in one breath and then cheer the firing of rockets in another because they now flow the other way. There are those who claim to be critical of the Zionist regime purely so they can veil their anti-Semitism. There are people who have fled to Australia for peace, prosperity and freedom, who challenge this way of life by imposing their brand of hate speech and intimidation on anyone who dares to criticise them. And how has this been allowed to continue in this country over the past 12 months? Simply, it has been a lack of leadership from this Prime Minister, a mealy-mouthed approach that even today has seen him speaking out of both sides of his mouth. It would have been nice if the government had stepped up and been decisive, that it had taken a zero-tolerance approach on this issue. It wasn't our fight, but it is becoming our fight as a result of this unfettered vitriol that has been permitted to proliferate. We cannot forget the damage that UNRWA has done, the United Nations organisation that's used money from Western nations, including our own, to radicalise and propagandise impressionable children in the Middle East to grow up with a hatred and dislike of Jews. I have spoken about UNRWA and their disgraceful behaviour in the past in this place. This was an organisation that employed terrorist sympathisers. It employed someone who even went so far as to pray that Hitler would return because his job was not finished. This is a history that we don't have time to go into today, going back thousands of years and tensions within neighbours. But we do need to remember that we wouldn't be standing here today 1 year and 1 day on from October 7th, if not for Hamas and by association Hezbollah and Iran, had they not broken the ceasefire, had they not attacked innocent young people at a music festival, families living in a kibbutz near the Gazan border, and not only torturing them, raping them, but as we saw last night, at a vigil held at the Israeli embassy, it wasn't just murder that occurred, it was something even more than that. And the fact that there is silence from those who know that many of these innocent, unarmed civilians were beheaded and their heads placed on the freeway that people were trying to escape from. People having to zigzag along the road to avoid hitting heads that had been placed there by terrorists. Terrorists wearing GoPros that were then posting this footage to their social media and proudly sharing with their families back home in Gaza how many Jews they had killed, how many women and children they had raped and tortured. It is beyond barbaric. It is not the behaviour of anyone with a drop of humanity in them. And the fact that we have seen those who sympathise with the plight of these murderers, and unfortunately some of them are in this place, but those could not contain themselves to allow one day of mourning. They could not allow the Jewish people, the Jewish community in Australia, and in fact all decent Australians, to commemorate, to remember what occurred on October 7th, what occurred when over 1,200 people died, were brutally murdered, the 240 hostages that were taken, 101 who are still being held, and they're not being held in military installations. They're not being held with access to the Red Cross, because they're being held in tunnels that Hamas builds under schools, under hospitals, as it cowardly hides amongst its civilians, using them as human shields. The intolerable and disgraceful behaviour of these groups knows no bounds. Yet those that appear to support Hamas, support Hezbollah, support the actions of Iran, support the eradication of Israel, who declare from the river to the sea, and I would challenge most of them to not even know what river or what sea they're talking about. But the fact that they continue on this disgraceful campaign against Israel is just beyond words. And it is just extraordinary to hear any Israeli or any Jewish person to be referred to as a coloniser. I notice, Senator McGrath, as you sit as the acting deputy president, you and I were in Israel together, and to walk along one of the roads that we did, that they are currently excavating around, where they think this is the path that Jesus most likely carried the cross, to know that thousands of years ago, to see where Jesus is supposed to have walked, himself a Jew, to hear and to read in the Bible the story of the Israelites going back thousands of years, yet to know that those who so misunderstand history, whether it ancient or modern, refer to Israel as colony, as colonisation, and denies their right to exist, when in fact it is very, very much their homeland, and that is exhibited no more by the location of Alaska, built on the top of the mount, on top of former Jewish temples. It is not the Jews that were the late arrivals in this land. And I do want to also acknowledge, it just breaks my heart every time I think about the two Bibas children, Kafir and Ariel. Kafir has recently marked his first birthday in captivity. Nobody knows if he is still alive, but this baby has now spent more time in captivity than he has at home on the kibbutz where he was living and so violently taken from. The fact that we saw in this place, in the other place this morning, the inability to have a bipartisan motion in acknowledgement of October 7th is a sad, sad indictment on this country's Prime Minister. It is a divergence away from the history of all Labor Prime Ministers we can go back on that have stood strongly with Israel, that understand the importance of our partnership and friendship with Israel. And yet this Prime Minister, cheap political scoring, point scoring, whether it's worried about seats in southwest Sydney, is prepared to undermine decades of bipartisanship where everyone, its parties of government, has recognised the importance of our relationship with Israel and the fact that they are a friend in an area of great volatility who best reflect our own democratic way of life. And the fact that the Prime Minister is more interested in playing political games than just standing up for the Jewish community, and the Jewish community know it. The Prime Minister really, in some ways, just stop pretending, because you are unable to actually stand up for not only Israel, but particularly the Jewish Australian community. We know that they don't feel safe, and that breaks my heart. That is unacceptable. It is unacceptable that people who came to this country looking for peace and stability, many of them now second and third generation, their grandparents Holocaust survivors, that they feel unsafe, that they would prefer to return to Israel that is under barrage of missile attacks and feel more safe there than they do with the current anti-Semitism running through our community in southwest Sydney on full display, but more importantly and more, I think, despairingly, on full display at so many of our universities, places that are supposed to be of higher learning, and yet they are now just hotbeds of anti-Semitism. It is absolutely disgraceful. The Holocaust didn't start with the gas chambers. And I would implore all of you that did not study modern history, or somehow that slipped out of your mind, because what is happening now is in so many ways almost repeating what happened in the lead up to World War II. Whether it was Crystal Night, and you look at the way that things have been, the attacks that have occurred on Jewish communities, Jewish businesses, Jewish schools, the fact aged care homes have to have armed guards securing them. We know schools do. It is absolutely appalling. But I do want to commend those Australians who have stood up and been counted and stood alongside our Jewish fellow citizens. That there are people who support you, and a lot of us that support you here in this country. And yesterday at the Never Again Is Now rally just down on Parliament House lawn, it was interesting to hear that, and I think this is an important message for people to hear, that, and I've been guilty of saying as well, that the silent majority of Australians stand strong with the Jewish community and support the Jewish community and are not anti-Semitic. But the time for being the silent majority is over. The time for silence is over. The time to speak up and say, this is not acceptable, this is not the country we live in, this is not the behaviour is appropriate for Australia, but it is not appropriate behaviour towards any group of fellow citizens, whomever they are, is just, it is extraordinary to hear that either the absolute, we know what happens up this end of the chamber with their undergraduate stunts and lack of understanding or ability to recognise what has actually occurred, how this has started. But I do want to say I stand with the Australian Jewish community. I honour them, and how they have been treated is appalling, and that they deserved the right to mark a day of mourning unimpeded by protest. And I apologise for many of us, well, I apologise for myself, maybe not all of us or many of us in this place, that there wasn't leadership from the government. There hasn't been leadership, whether from October 9 onwards last year, but there has not been leadership that has stopped the appalling behaviour of these protesters, intimidating you on what should have been a very, very solemn day of remembrance.